The late afternoon sun hung low over the sprawling U.S. naval base, casting long shadows across the neatly lined barracks and the endless rows of vehicles stationed on the tarmac. The base was alive with its usual rhythm boots striking the concrete in unison, the hum of helicopters overhead, and the sharp whistles of drill instructors echoing through the crisp air. To the untrained eye, everything appeared orderly, efficient, and disciplined. But Admiral Sarah Mitchell knew better than to trust surface appearances. She had seen too many bases in her decades of service, each with its polished exterior for visitors, and each with cracks, waiting to be revealed to those who looked close enough. And Sarah was nothing if not observant. That morning, she had deliberately chosen not to wear the insignia or formal attire that instantly marked her rank. Instead, she dressed in a simple working uniform plain, neat but nondescript. It was a calculated decision. Admirals rarely appeared unannounced, and when they did, soldiers scrambled to paint over flaws. Sarah didn't want the base polished for her arrival. She wanted it raw, unfiltered, authentic. Her driver had dropped her at the edge of the compound rather than the front gates, another choice she had insisted on. "If I walk the grounds myself," she had explained to her aide earlier that week, "I'll see the truth of how this place functions." She stepped through the gates quietly, duffel bag slung over her shoulder. Most of the soldiers she passed didn't look twice. To them, she was just another officer, perhaps a new arrival, perhaps a transfer. A few nodded curtly. Others ignored her entirely. Sarah noticed the details. An untucked shirt here, a half-polished boot there, a pair of soldiers slouching in conversation when they should have been at attention. Small things, but small things grew into larger problems when discipline eroded. She didn't frown, didn't speak, she simply observed. Every detail mattered. At the far end of the main corridor, she stopped near a bulletin board pinned with outdated safety notices and incomplete schedules. Papers were curling at the edges, taped hastily, some nearly illegible. Her sharp eyes narrowed. This was her first red flag. In a base like this, order wasn't just about combat readiness. It was about the mindset drilled into every corner, every poster, every habit. If something as small as a notice board was neglected, she knew she'd uncover deeper negligence. As she studied the board, she became aware of the heavy footsteps echoing behind her. A man's voice, low but tense, barked down the hallway, ordering two younger soldiers back to their posts. The footsteps grew louder until they stopped directly behind her. "Hey, you," the voice snapped, sharp as a blade. Sarah turned slowly. Standing before her was Sergeant Daniel Harris, his uniform pressed, but his jaw clenched tight, his posture carrying both authority and aggression. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with eyes that burned from too many sleepless nights. To anyone else, he was an intimidating presence. To Sarah, he was a study in barely restrained volatility. "What are you doing here?" Harris demanded, his voice gruff. His gaze flicked from her boots to her plain uniform, scanning for rank insignia he didn't see. His suspicion sharpened. "This is a restricted corridor. You don't belong here." Sarah remained silent, her expression unreadable. Her silence seemed to provoke him further. Harris stepped closer, towering over her. "I asked you a question, officer. Who cleared you to be here?" Still, Sarah said nothing. She wasn't being defiant. She was testing him. His reaction to perceived disobedience would tell her far more about his leadership than any record on file. The silence stretched like a drawn bowstring. Harris's patience snapped. With a sudden, forceful movement, he grabbed her by the shoulder and shoved her back against the wall. The sound of her duffel bag thudding against the concrete echoed through the corridor. Gasps came from a few soldiers down the hall who had stopped to watch. Sarah didn't flinch. Her eyes met his with a steady calm that unnerved him. She could have spoken a single word, revealed her rank, crushed his authority in an instant, but she didn't. Instead, she let the moment hang, her composure contrasting starkly against his aggression. "Answer me," Harris growled, his voice low. His grip loosened slightly, but the intensity in his eyes didn't waver. Inside, Sarah's thoughts were sharp and precise. This was the kind of soldier she had dealt with countless times, trained, disciplined in combat, but broken somewhere along the way. His aggression wasn't random. It was armor, a shield built from years of scars. She wondered how many subordinates had suffered under his temper. She also wondered whether that temper could be reforged into something useful, or whether it would consume him. Harris, on the other hand, couldn't understand why the woman before him radiated such unsettling calm. Most officers, even higher-ranking ones, would have barked back by now, threatened him, or panicked. But she just looked at him, steady, deliberate, unafraid. The corridor grew quieter. The air thickened with tension. Harris could feel eyes on him. Soldiers were whispering, watching, waiting. And though he didn't know it yet, every one of them would remember this moment. Sarah's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile, not amusement, but certainty. The pieces were already moving. This base was about to change. But for now, she said nothing. Not yet. The corridor was silent, except for the sharp echoes of boots and the low hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Sergeant Daniel Harris stood rigid, his hand still hovering near Admiral Sarah Mitchell's shoulder after shoving her against the wall. His pulse hammered in his ears, fueled by suspicion, irritation, and a sense of duty warped by stress. To him, she was just another outsider, an intruder who had no business wandering restricted sections of the base. Sarah's stillness unnerved him. Most soldiers who had faced Harris's wrath would have barked back, argued, or flinched. But this woman did none of those things. Her eyes stayed fixed on his, steady and unyielding, as though she were silently dissecting his very soul. Harris tightened his jaw. "You think this is a game?" His voice rumbled like distant thunder. "I asked you a direct question, officer. You don't get to ignore me." Sarah tilted her head slightly, almost imperceptibly, studying him with a calm that only stoked his anger further. She could see the years etched into his features, lines of exhaustion around his eyes, a scar that cut across his temple, the stiffness in his shoulders that spoke of both discipline and unhealed wounds. He was a soldier hardened by war zones, perhaps too hardened. Still, she said nothing. The silence spread like a contagion. Two young privates who had lingered at the far end of the hall shifted uneasily, whispering between themselves. They had seen Sergeant Harris lose his temper before, but never like this. There was something different about the woman, something in her composure that unsettled even the observers. "Don't test me," Harris snapped. His voice rose, echoing against the bare walls. "You don't belong here, and until you tell me who you are, I'll treat you like any other trespasser." He stepped forward again, his shadow falling over her. His hand gripped the strap of her duffel bag as if daring her to resist. Sarah remained utterly calm. Her breathing was steady, her posture unshaken. She allowed herself one small, deliberate movement. She straightened the collar of her plain uniform with her free hand. No trembling, no protest, just calm defiance. It was the kind of gesture Harris didn't know how to process. His instincts screamed at him to maintain control, to assert dominance, but a sliver of doubt began to gnaw at the edges of his mind. Why wasn't she afraid? Why wasn't she defensive? Inside, Sarah's thoughts were as sharp as a blade. So this is the sergeant the reports hinted about, she mused. Aggressive, quick to act. But is it recklessness? Or protection born of fear? Her silence wasn't submission, it was strategy. Every second she let him unravel, she learned more about him than she ever could from his file. Harris growled in frustration, his voice booming. "Answer me." He slammed a fist against the wall, just inches from her head, the sound reverberating like gunfire. The young privates flinched, one of them muttering, "He's gonna get himself killed doing this." Sarah's gaze didn't flicker. Not once. Then she spoke softly, evenly, but with a weight that cut through the tension like a knife. "Is this how you lead, Sergeant?" The words struck Harris harder than any shout could have. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. For a moment, he felt exposed, like she had peeled back the layers of armor he had built around himself. Her voice carried no fear, only a quiet authority that made him falter. But before he could respond, the sound of boots clicking sharply against the floor broke the moment. A young officer rounded the corner, stopped dead at the sight of the confrontation, and froze. His eyes widened as recognition flooded his face. "Admiral Mitchell," he blurted out, snapping into a salute so crisp it echoed. The air in the corridor changed instantly. The private stiffened, eyes darting between Harris and the woman he had just manhandled. Harris felt the blood drain from his face, a cold wave of realization crashing over him. "Admiral?" His throat went dry. His mind scrambled through the implications. This wasn't just an officer he had shoved against the wall. This was the Admiral. His Admiral. The highest authority he could answer to on this base. And he had treated her like a trespasser. Harris's heart pounded so loudly he could barely hear the officer's salute. His knees almost buckled under the weight of humiliation. His reputation, his career, could be over in a single breath. Sarah stepped forward, the faintest trace of controlled power in her stride. She adjusted her sleeve calmly, as though nothing had happened, and fixed Harris with a gaze so sharp he could feel it cut through him. Her words were low, deliberate, but they carried enough force to silence the entire corridor. "Is this," she said, each word measured, "how you treat those under your protection, Sergeant Harris?" A question landed like a hammer. Harris opened his mouth, stammering, I didn't know. I thought what?" She interrupted, her tone cool but deadly precise. That shoving a fellow officer against a wall without cause was acceptable. That intimidation equals leadership? Harris swallowed hard. His chest felt heavy, his pride crumbling under the weight of her words. He wanted to explain himself, to argue that he had been vigilant, that he had been protecting the base, but the truth tasted bitter. Nothing could excuse what he had done. The corridor was suffocatingly silent now. Dozens of eyes burned into Harris's back, soldiers frozen in place, waiting to see what would happen. Sarah let the silence stretch just long enough for the lesson to sink in. Then she stepped past him, her voice calm but commanding. "Report to my office at 1800 hours, she said. "We'll discuss this further." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The authority in her tone left no room for disobedience. Harris's hand shot up instinctively in a salute, though it trembled. "Yes, Admiral," he managed, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah didn't look back. She strode down the corridor with quiet dignity, leaving behind whispers that spread like wildfire. Harris stood frozen, shame flooding every nerve. For the first time in years, a man known for his iron will and hot temper felt stripped bare, powerless, exposed, and utterly humiliated. And deep down, beneath the humiliation, a gnawing fear crept in. This wasn't over. The silence in the corridor lingered long after Admiral Sarah Mitchell's footsteps faded. Sergeant Daniel Harris stood rooted in place, his salute still frozen mid-her, even though she had already disappeared down the hallway. His chest burned, each breath sharp with humiliation. An Admiral. He had shoved an Admiral against a wall. The realization pounded in his skull like artillery fire. His mind replayed the moment on a loop, her calm stare, Her steady silence, the way she had let him spiral into rage before delivering those words that cut deeper than any reprimand. Harris wasn't easily shaken, but now his confidence, his pride, even his identity as a leader seemed to crack beneath the weight of her presence. The young officer who had saluted her glanced nervously at Harris before slipping away, clearly unwilling to get caught in the aftermath. The two privates whispered furiously to each other, their wide eyes darting between the sergeant and the empty hallway. Within an hour, Harris knew the entire base would be buzzing. Soldiers thrived on gossip, and this was fuel for a bonfire. He clenched his fists and forced himself to move, each step heavy as he retreated to his quarters. Inside, the walls seemed to close in. Harris tossed his cap onto the desk and dragged a hand down his face, trying to steady his thoughts. How did I let it get this far? He had built his career on discipline, vigilance, and a reputation for being unyielding. Soldiers respected him because he was strict, sometimes too strict, but they followed him. And now, in a single reckless act, he had jeopardized it all. Not because of an enemy, not because of battle, but because he had failed to control himself in front of the one person who could end his career with a single order. At 1800 hours, he would face her again. He had no idea what she would decide. Punishment? Emotion? A court-martial? Any of those outcomes would ruin him. But something about her eyes haunted him. She hadn't looked at him with hatred. She hadn't screamed or threatened. She had studied him, judged him. It was as though she had seen right through him, past the uniform and the anger, into the fractured man beneath. The thought unsettled him more than her rank. Meanwhile, Sarah sat in her temporary office, reviewing files by the glow of her desk lamp. A cup of untouched coffee sat cooling beside her. Her thoughts kept circling back to Harris. She wasn't new to confrontation. In her years of service, she had faced insurgents, politicians, even fellow admirals who underestimated her. But Harris was different. He had acted without hesitation, guided by instinct rather than cruelty. It wasn't malice that drove him to shove her. It was mistrust, frustration, maybe even fear. She flipped through his personnel file, her eyes scanning lines she had already read before arriving at the base. Sergeant Daniel Harris. 8 years active duty. Multiple deployments in conflict zones overseas. Commendations for bravery under fire. Wounded twice. No family listed. But then came the other note's complaints of excessive force during training, clashes with fellow officers, reprimands for insubordination. Nothing severe enough to end his career, but enough to paint a picture of a man always walking a tightrope between valor and volatility. Sarah leaned back in her chair. She could end his career tomorrow, and no one would question her decision. Yet something held her back. If he can be broken down this easily, she thought, he can also be rebuilt. The base was struggling. She had already seen enough signs. Poor discipline, neglected drills, officers cutting corners. A sergeant like Harris could either be part of the problem or part of the solution. The question was whether he was willing to learn. When 1800 hours arrived, Harris stood outside her office door, palms sweating beneath his gloves. He had faced enemy fire without flinching, but now his stomach twisted into knots. He straightened his uniform twice, trying to shake the tremor in his hands before knocking. "Enter," came Sarah's voice, calm but commanding. He stepped inside, saluting sharply. "Sergeant Harris reporting as ordered, Admiral." Sarah didn't look up immediately. She finished signing a document, her pen scratching softly against the paper, then set it aside. Finally, her eyes lifted to meet his. "Sit," he obeyed, the chair creaking slightly under his weight. For a long moment, Sarah simply studied him, her gaze as sharp as it had been in the hallway. Harris shifted uncomfortably under the scrutiny. "Do you know?" she began, her voice even, what the difference is between a soldier and a leader. Harris swallowed. Discipline, ma'am. Discipline is part of it, she replied. But it's more than that. A soldier follows orders. A leader protects the people under those orders. Even when it's inconvenient. Even when they frustrate you. Especially then. Her words stung. Harris clenched his jaw. I thought you were a threat to the base, he muttered. Sarah arched an eyebrow. And your first instinct was violence? No verification, no questions? Just force? Harris's chest tightened. I was on edge, Admiral. I've seen too many people slip through the cracks. Too many mistakes that cost lives. Sarah leaned forward, her hands clasped. That's not an excuse. It's an explanation. But explanations don't save soldiers' lives. Discipline does. Judgment does. And what I saw today was neither. Her voice wasn't raised, but each word felt heavier than a shouted order. Harris stared at the floor, shame creeping up his spine. But then her tone shifted, softer but no less firm. You're not the first soldier to let the battlefield follow him home, Sergeant. And you won't be the last. The difference is how you choose to carry it. Harris looked up surprised. Sarah held his gaze. I should court-martial you. Instead, I'm giving you a chance. You'll assist me personally during this inspection. Every step, every briefing, every drill. You will shadow me until I decide you've learned something, or until you prove you can't. Harris blinked, caught between relief and disbelief. Assist you, Admiral? You heard me. Her tone brooked no argument. Consider it punishment. Or an opportunity. That depends on you. For the first time since the incident, Harris felt a flicker of something other than shame. Confusion, yes, but also curiosity. Why give him this chance? Why not end his career and move on? He straightened in his chair, his voice low but steady. Yes, Admiral. Sarah leaned back, her expression unreadable. Dismissed. Harris rose, saluted, and left the office. As the door clicked shut behind him, he let out a slow breath. His humiliation hadn't ended, but it had transformed. This was no longer about survival. It was about proving himself. And though he wouldn't admit it yet, part of him wanted to understand the woman who had broken him down with nothing more than silence and a single question. That night, as he lay in his bunk staring at the ceiling, Harris replayed her words. Is this how you treat those under your protection? For the first time in years, the question kept him awake more than any memory of battle. And deep down, something shifted. Something he wasn't ready to name yet. The news spread through the base like wildfire. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, every corridor, every mess hall, every bunkhouse buzzed with whispers about what had happened in the East Wing hallway. The sergeant shoved her against the wall. He didn't know she was the Admiral. She didn't scream. She didn't punish him. Yet, each soldier told the story differently, adding their own embellishments. But the ending was always the same. Sergeant Daniel Harris had crossed a line most never even dared to imagine. And somehow, he was still standing. In the barracks, soldiers stole glances at him, but avoided direct eye contact. Some whispered behind his back. Others smirked with a mix of amusement and disbelief. But what unnerved Harris most was the silence. Those who said nothing at all, who simply watched him with curious eyes, waiting to see what the Admiral would do. For the first time in his career, Harris felt stripped of control. His authority, once ironclad, had cracked, and no amount of shouting at his subordinates would mend it. At 1800 hours sharp, Harris stood outside Admiral Sarah Mitchell's office. He had been dismissed earlier, but summoned again for a private conversation. This time, he wore his uniform with surgical precision creases sharp, boots polished, posture flawless. If he was going down, he would not go down sloppy. He knocked once firmly. Enter. Her voice carried the same calm authority as before, neither welcoming nor cold, just measured, controlled. Harris stepped inside, saluted. Sarah didn't return it immediately. She finished reading a report, laid it flat on her desk, and only then acknowledged him with a slight nod. Sit. The word was simple, but it carried weight. Harris sat. The office was modest, only temporarily assigned to her during her inspection visit. A desk, a pair of chairs, a filing cabinet. But the atmosphere was heavy, as though the walls themselves leaned in to listen. Sarah studied him for a moment. Harris held her gaze, though a knot tightened in his stomach. He had faced interrogations before, but never like this. This wasn't an enemy trying to break him. This was someone dissecting him with nothing but silence. Finally, Sarah spoke. "Why?" Harris blinked. "Admiral? Why did you act the way you did?" Her tone was firm, but not accusing, more curious than anything. "Why did you shove me against the wall before even verifying who I was?" Harris's mouth went dry. He considered giving the easy answer protocol, vigilance, suspicion, but something about her eyes told him that wouldn't be enough. "I thought you didn't belong here," he admitted. "Your uniform wasn't marked. You looked out of place. And I've seen what happens when people slip through unchecked." Sarah leaned back, her fingers interlaced on the desk. "So you assumed. And instead of asking questions, you used force." Harris clenched his jaw. "Ma'am, I've spent years in combat zones. Out there, hesitation gets people killed. You see someone suspicious, you act. That's how you survive." Her eyes softened slightly, but her voice remained steady. "This isn't a battlefield, Sergeant. This is a base. These walls are supposed to protect, not intimidate. Your instincts may have saved you in combat, but here, they'll destroy the very discipline you're meant to uphold." Harris felt the sting of her words. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, but deep down, he knew she was right. He had been carrying the war inside him long after leaving the battlefield. Sarah's tone shifted, quieter but sharper. "How long has it been since your last deployment?" 2 years, Admiral." "And how many before that?" Harris's eyes flickered. 5 deployments in 6 years. Sarah nodded slowly. "I see." She tapped a finger lightly on the desk. "You've lived in survival mode for so long, Sergeant. You've forgotten what leadership looks like outside of war. You're not protecting your soldiers anymore. You're suffocating them." The words hit like a punch. Harris's pride bristled, but he couldn't deny the truth. He remembered the way some of the younger soldiers flinched under his commands, the way they avoided his gaze. He had mistaken fear for respect. Sarah leaned forward now, her eyes locked on his. "Tell me honestly, how many of your men do you think would follow you, because they trust you, not because they fear you?" Harris's chest tightened. He opened his mouth and closed it again. No words came. The silence was damning. Sarah let it stretch for a moment before she continued. "You're not the first soldier I've seen like this, and you won't be the last. But the difference between those who change and those who fall is simple: humility. The ability to admit when you're wrong. Can you do that, Sergeant?" Harris shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Humility was not a language he spoke easily. His entire career had been built on confidence, authority, and decisiveness. To admit weakness felt like betrayal. But in this room, under her gaze, denial seemed impossible. "I don't know," he admitted quietly. It was the closest thing to vulnerability he had spoken in years. Sarah studied him a moment longer, then leaned back. "That's a start." She picked up a folder and slid it across the desk toward him. These are reports from the last 3 inspections. Read them. Tomorrow, you'll accompany me on my rounds. You'll see what I see, hear what I hear. Consider this a test. You'll either learn something, or you'll prove to me that you're incapable of change. Which way it goes is up to you. Harris stared at the folder. You're not punishing me, Admiral? Her eyes narrowed slightly. Don't mistake this for leniency. This is punishment. You'll answer directly to me until I decide otherwise. No shortcuts. No excuses. And if you fail me, I won't hesitate to end your career. Do you understand? Harris's jaw tightened. Yes, Admiral. She dismissed him with a nod. Good. Dismissed. He rose, saluted sharply, and exited the office. The cool night air hit him as he stepped outside. The base was quiet, the hum of distant machinery filling the silence. Harris clutched the folder in his hand, his mind a storm. He had expected fury. He had expected humiliation in front of the entire base. Instead, she had done something far worse. She had seen him, stripped him bare, shown him the cracks he had spent years hiding. For the first time, Harris questioned not just his actions, but his entire way of leading. Fear had been his weapon, his armor. But what if she was right? What if it was hollow? Back in her office, Sarah closed the door softly behind him and allowed herself a rare sigh. She had dealt with men like Harris before, soldiers trapped between valor and destruction. Most resisted until the end. But she had seen something in him tonight. A flicker. A possibility. Whether it grew or died would depend on what he did next. And Sarah Mitchell intended to find out. The transformation of a soldier rarely came in silence, it came in fire. For Sergeant Daniel Harris, that fire arrived 3 days after Sarah Mitchell handed him the reins during inspections. It started with an alarm. The base was jolted awake at 0430 hours. Sirens wailed across the compound, red lights pulsed along the barracks walls, and the intercom barked a single word no one wanted to hear. Breach! Harris leapt from his bunk instantly, boots half-laced, adrenaline igniting his veins. Training kicked in before thought. He was on the move in seconds, barking orders to his squad as chaos erupted. Soldiers scrambled for gear, weapons clattered, radios hissed with conflicting reports. East perimeter, possible breach. No confirmation yet, stand by for command. The message repeated, but no one was standing by. Confusion reigned. Harris burst into the yard. Floodlights bathed the perimeter fence, shadows stretching long across the ground. Soldiers clustered in groups, half waiting, half panicking. It was the kind of chaos he used to dominate with a roar of authority. His throat almost tightened, ready to unleash the old Harris, loud, merciless, commanding through fear. But then he saw Admiral Sarah Mitchell standing at the far end of the yard, calm amid the storm. She wasn't yelling. She wasn't rushing. She was watching. Watching him. This wasn't just a breach. This was the test. Harris forced himself to breathe, fists clenching. He remembered her words. Silence kills more soldiers than bullets. Not this time. Squads Alpha and Bravo East fence, full gear move. He shouted, his voice steady but sharp. Charlie squad, secure the motor pool. No one gets in or out until confirmed clear. Delta medical prep. I want stretchers ready and triage standing by. Move like you mean it. The difference was immediate. His voice wasn't just bark, it carried clarity. Orders flowed like water, cutting through panic. Soldiers snapped into motion, their scattered energy redirected. Still, tension gnawed at his chest. Would they obey because they trusted him, or because they still feared him? He didn't have time to dwell. The east fence came into view. Floodlights revealed a gaping tear in the chain link, the steel edges curled inward like claws. A breach reel, not a drill. Beyond the fence, shadows shifted in the tree line. Movement. Hold position. Harris ordered, raising a fist. His soldiers froze, rifles trained. The old Harris would have stormed forward, guns blazing, demanding dominance. But something in his gut reminded him. Hesitation wasn't always weakness. Sometimes it was wisdom. He crouched, scanning the tree line. The shadows weren't organized. No formation, no advance. Just scattered figures. Civilians? Saboteurs? Deserters? Admiral, visual on contact's uncertain identity. Harris reported into his radio. Her voice came back calm, measured. Assess first. Don't assume. The words grounded him. He signaled 2 scouts forward. Careful, low, disciplined. Within minutes, they returned, breathless. Sergeant, they're refugees. Families, unarmed. Harris blinked. Refugees? Out here? His instincts had screamed, threat. Yet Sarah's voice echoed again. Don't assume. The decision now sat squarely in his hands. He could push them back, force them away from the perimeter. It would be easy, fast, clean. But the refugees, half-starved, carrying children, looked less like infiltrators and more like survivors. Harris hesitated. His soldiers waited. Every second stretched, heavy with expectation. Finally, he lowered his rifle. Stand down. Hold your fire. He approached the breach slowly, signaling for his troops to cover, but not engage. The figures emerged, 7 of them. Ragged clothes, dirt-streaked faces. A woman clutched a child. An old man limped. Not a single weapon among them. The soldiers behind Harris exchanged uneasy looks. They weren't used to him pausing, weighing, showing restraint. But Harris ignored the whispers. He keyed his radio again. Admiral, confirming civilians. Advise? There was a pause before Sarah's voice answered. What do you think should be done, Sergeant? The test again. Harris closed his eyes briefly. He remembered the inspections, the weary cook, the trembling corporal. He remembered what Sarah had said about seeing people, not just uniforms. We'll bring them in, he said finally. Secure them, check for injuries, and get intel. We can't turn them back into the woods at night. Copy, Sarah replied. There was the faintest trace of approval in her voice. The base shifted from chaos to tense relief as the refugees were escorted inside. Medical staff tended to them. Soldiers secured the breach. Engineers prepared temporary reinforcements. But Harris wasn't done. He paced along the fence, examining the cut. It was deliberate. Precision tool work, not randomware. He radioed in. Admiral, breach wasn't accidental. Someone cut this fence. Civilians were a distraction. The silence on the other end lasted only a moment, but Harris felt its weight. Good eye, Sergeant. Double perimeter watch. Full recon sweep. I'll join you at the command post. The refugees were innocent, but someone else had used them as cover. And the game wasn't over. Inside the command post, Sarah arrived with her usual poise. She listened as Harris laid out his findings, his assessment of the breach, and his orders to the squads. For the first time, she didn't interrupt, didn't correct. She let him lead. When he finished, she studied him in silence, her sharp eyes searching. Harris braced for criticism. Instead, she gave the slightest nod. You're learning, she said simply. It wasn't praise. Not fully. But to Harris, it felt heavier than any medal. Later that night, long after the breach was secured and the refugees settled, Harris found himself alone again outside the barracks. The weight of the day pressed on him. For the first time in years, he hadn't acted on raw instinct. He had paused. He had listened. And it had saved lives, not just his soldiers, but innocent civilians too. Sarah approached quietly, as she often did. She stood beside him, hands clasped behind her back. "You did well," she said softly. Harris exhaled slowly. "I almost didn't. That's the point." She turned to him, her expression softer than he had ever seen. "Courage isn't just charging forward, Sergeant. Sometimes it's standing still long enough to see the truth." Harris nodded, the lesson sinking deep. But Sarah's eyes hardened again, her voice sharpening. "Don't celebrate yet. Whoever cut that fence isn't done. And when they come back, the real test will begin." Her words chilled him. The crisis wasn't over. It was only beginning. That night, Harris couldn't sleep. Not because of fear, but because of realization. For years, he had been the kind of leader who saw only threats. Tonight, for the first time, he had seen people. And in that moment, Sergeant Daniel Harris began to understand the kind of leader he might yet become. The following morning, Sergeant Daniel Harris reported to Admiral Sarah Mitchell's office at 06:00 sharp. Sleep had been a stranger that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her piercing gaze, her words echoing in his head. "You're not protecting your soldiers anymore. You're suffocating them." When he entered, Sarah was already there standing, not sitting reviewing the day's schedule, pinned neatly to a clipboard. She didn't greet him with a smile or a nod, just a curt acknowledgement of his presence. "You're late," she said without looking up. Harris stiffened. "Admiral, he glanced at the clock. 06:00 exactly." Sarah's eyes lifted to his. "And you thought that was good enough?" Harris froze. He had always lived by the clock. But as she turned and walked past him, the point sank in. Being on time wasn't the same as being prepared. "Follow me," she ordered. The day began with inspections. Not the kind Harris was used to, the superficial checks, the polished boots, the clean bunks. Sarah looked deeper. She asked questions. She spoke directly to privates and corporals, sometimes bypassing lieutenants entirely. In the motor pool, she questioned the mechanics about the condition of their equipment. When one young corporal hesitated, fumbling with her words, Harris almost barked at her to answer quickly. But Sarah raised a hand, silencing him. "Take your time," Sarah said gently to the corporal. "I'm not here to rush you. I'm here to hear you." The girl explained that several vehicles had been overdue for maintenance because paperwork approvals had been delayed. Harris tensed, knowing those delays traced back to his desk. Sarah made a note, said nothing to Harris directly, and moved on. In the mess hall, Sarah didn't just glance at food quality. She spoke with kitchen staff, asked about supply shortages, and checked records. Again, issues appeared. Again, Harris saw his fingerprints all over them. His rigid leadership had slowed processes, blocked requests, and created bottlenecks. By midday, Harris's confidence had cracked. He wasn't the rock-solid sergeant he'd believed himself to be. He was a cog that had jammed the machine, and no one had told him, because no one dared to. After hours of rounds, Sarah finally dismissed her entourage of aides and junior officers. Only Harris remained. She led him to a small training field behind the barracks, away from the noise of the base. The sun beat down, sweat soaked through his uniform, and still she said nothing for several minutes, pacing slowly like a predator circling prey. Finally, she stopped and turned to him. "Tell me what you saw today." Harris swallowed. His throat felt dry, his mind heavy. "I saw inefficiency, gaps in communication, failure to meet protocol." Sarah's brow arched. "Protocol? That's what you saw?" Harris hesitated. His instinct was to cling to rules, to lean on procedure. But the memory of the corporal's nervous face, The weary cook's tired explanation struck him. He dropped his gaze. "No, Admiral. I saw people. People frustrated by the system. People afraid to speak up. People I should have listened to." Sarah nodded slowly. "Better. Now tell me this. Why didn't they speak up before?" Harris's jaw tightened. He knew the answer, but speaking it aloud tasted like ash. "Because of me." Her silence confirmed it. The weight of the admission sank into his chest like a stone. Sarah stepped closer, her voice low but sharp. "You've ruled with fear. You thought fear equaled strength. But what you've built isn't respect, it's silence. Silence kills more soldiers than bullets ever will." Harris flinched, not from her words, but from the truth behind them. He remembered faces men and women he had commanded in combat hesitant to question orders, even when doubt flickered in their eyes. Some of them never came back. "Admiral." His voice cracked for the first time in years. "If I've been leading wrong all this time, then what am I?" Sarah studied him with a gaze that was sharp but not cruel. "You're a soldier. A soldier who has survived, but not yet learned to live. That can change if you're willing." For the next week, Harris shadowed Sarah at every step. It was grueling, not because of physical demands, but because of the constant, unrelenting mirror she held up to him. Every inspection revealed failures he had overlooked. Every conversation with subordinates revealed a truth he had ignored. Each time, Sarah forced him to see, not with anger, but with precision. He saw how she commanded respect without raising her voice. How soldiers leaned forward when she spoke, not out of fear, but out of genuine attention. She remembered names. She remembered stories. She listened. One evening, after a long day, Harris found himself sitting outside the barracks alone, the weight of it all pressing on him. For the first time in years, doubt crept in, not the doubt of survival, but the doubt of identity. He wasn't sure who he was anymore. The soldier who barked commands and shoved people into line? Or the man trying to understand what leadership really meant? As the night deepened, Sarah joined him. She didn't speak right away. She simply sat beside him, both staring at the distant lights of the airstrip. Finally, she said, "You know, Sergeant, when I was your age, I thought exactly like you. Hard, unbending, certain that respect came from authority." Harris turned, surprised. "You?" Sarah smirked faintly. "Oh yes, I had a reputation for breaking soldiers down until they either quit or conformed. I thought that made me strong. It didn't. It made me blind." She looked at him, her voice softening. "The military doesn't need machines, Harris. It needs leaders. Leaders who can see the people behind the uniforms. Because when the fight comes, and it always comes, it won't be protocol that saves you. It'll be trust. Trust built long before the bullets fly." Her words pierced him deeper than any reprimand. He realized then that she wasn't trying to destroy him. She was trying to rebuild him. And for the first time, Harris wanted that too. The next morning, during another inspection, Sarah surprised him. She stopped mid-tour and turned to Harris in front of the troops. "Sergeant," she said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "you lead this one." Harris froze. Dozens of eyes turned toward him. His instincts screamed at him to bark commands, to tighten discipline, to regain control the only way he knew. But then he remembered the corporal's trembling voice, the cook's weary face, Sarah's piercing words. He took a breath, and instead of shouting, he asked questions. He listened. He encouraged. It was awkward, clumsy, even uncomfortable. But for the first time, the soldiers didn't look afraid. They looked engaged. Sarah said nothing, but the faintest flicker of approval crossed her eyes. For Harris, it was the smallest step forward. But it was a step all the same. That night, alone in his bunk, Harris stared at the ceiling. He realized something terrifying but freeing. The sergeant who had shoved an admiral against the wall was gone. In his place was a man still rough, still imperfect, but finally willing to learn. And the true test had only just begun. The base didn't sleep after the breach. Spotlights swept the perimeter, patrols doubled their routes, and tension weighed heavy in every hallway. The refugees had been secured in the infirmary wing under watch, and while they appeared harmless, the knowledge that someone had deliberately cut the fence hung over the compound like a storm cloud. Sergeant Daniel Harris hadn't rested since the night of the breach. He sat in the command post, fatigue tugging at his eyes, but his mind sharpened by unease. Sarah Mitchell was there, too calm as ever, as though the tension only fueled her focus. She studied maps, marked supply routes, and listened carefully to every report. At 0230, it began. The first explosion rattled the east perimeter tower. Glass shattered, alarms screamed, and before the dust even settled, gunfire ripped through the night. Contact! Contact! North sector, multiple hostiles heavily armed. Crackled the radio. Harris bolted upright, adrenaline snapping through his body. This was no drill. The saboteurs had returned, this time not hiding behind civilians, but armed to destroy. Sarah's voice cut through the chaos with surgical calm. Harris, command is yours. I'll observe. It was the trial by fire she had been preparing him for. No more shadows, no more lessons in safe halls. This was the crucible. Harris grabbed his gear and stormed out with his men, the air thick with smoke and the staccato bursts of gunfire. The northern perimeter lit up with muzzle flashes as figures moved just beyond the fence line, firing suppressive rounds. His squads were scattered, pinned. Panic clawed at the edges of discipline. Soldiers shouted conflicting reports, some crouched behind barriers, others firing blindly into the night. The old Harris would have roared, demanded silence through fear. His lungs filled, ready to unleash until he caught sight of Sarah standing behind him, silent but steady, her eyes on him, watching, not the old way, not anymore. He took a deep breath and forced his voice into something steady, cutting but controlled. Alpha cover fire, short bursts only. Bravo flank left, use the drainage ditch for cover. Charlie, you're with me, push forward. Control the breach point. The order sliced through the noise, clear and actionable. Soldiers moved, not with fear, but with purpose. Harris advanced with Charlie's squad, bullets whistling past, dirt spraying up at his boots. He dropped low, motioning them forward, directing fire with sharp hand signals. The adrenaline didn't drown him this time. It sharpened him. At the fence, he caught sight of the saboteurs. 6, maybe 7, dressed in dark tactical gear, working in pairs. They weren't random raiders. They moved like trained operatives. Their fire was disciplined, their cover coordinated. This wasn't sabotage. This was an assault. Harris ducked as a burst of fire chewed through the barricade near his head. Suppress! Suppress! He barked, and his squad responded with disciplined volleys. The operatives shifted positions, trying to exploit the chaos, but Harris read their movements like a book. His combat years spoke through instinct, but now tempered by strategy, not rage. He keyed his radio. Bravo, close the left flank. Alpha, shift your fire, force them to bunch up. It worked. Under pressure, the attackers clustered, their coordination fraying. Harris seized the moment. Charlie on me. Advance. They surged forward, Harris leading, controlled aggression in every step. Bullets cracked past, one grazing his sleeve, but he pressed on, vaulting to a reinforced position by the fence. He raised his rifle, fired 2 clean shots, 1 hostile down, the others scattering back. For a heartbeat, silence rippled across the field. Then came a second explosion, this one closer, inside the motor pool. Harris's blood ran cold. Admiral secondary breach, west side. He barked into the radio. Sarah's voice came back calm, measured. You hold the north. I'll redirect reinforcements. Trust me. For a moment, Harris wanted to argue, to demand control of both fronts. But her words grounded him. Trust. He had to lead his sector, not chase shadows. He turned to his men, who waited on him with eyes wide, rifles trembling. For years, he'd seen that look fear. But this time, he answered it not with fury, but with presence. We hold here. Harris shouted. No one breaks this line. You hear me? No one. The words weren't empty rage. They were a promise. And the soldiers clung to it like armor. The firefight dragged on. Smoke choked the air. Radios hissed with reports of movement near the motor pool. But Harris's focus never wavered. His squads fought with precision, covering each other, following his lead. The fear hadn't vanished, but it had transformed into cohesion. As the attackers tried one final push, Harris saw it, their formation breaking, their timing sloppy. This was the moment. Alpha, Bravo, push forward. Drive them back. Together, the squad surged. Gunfire thundered. Flashbangs cracked the night, and within minutes, the saboteurs retreated, vanishing into the tree line. The base was battered, smoking, but still standing. Harris lowered his rifle slowly, his breath ragged. His men regrouped around him, tired but alive. And for the first time, they didn't look at him with fear. They looked at him with trust. Sarah approached from the shadows, her uniform smudged with dirt, but her posture unbroken. She surveyed the scene, the smoking perimeter, the exhausted soldiers, the broken fence, and then turned to Harris. You led them well, she said. Harris swallowed hard, adrenaline still coursing through him. I almost lost them. Sarah's eyes narrowed slightly. No, you almost lost yourself. But you didn't. That's the difference. Her gaze shifted toward the west, where medics rushed to put out fires near the motor pool. This isn't over. Whoever sent those men will try again. But tonight, you proved something. Not to me. To them. She motioned toward the soldiers gathering near Harris, their shoulders squared a little higher, their eyes fixed on him. They followed you because they trusted you, Sarah said softly. Not because they feared you. The words hit harder than any bullet. Harris stood there, surrounded by men and women who had once dreaded his presence, now clinging to it for strength. For the first time in his career, Harris understood what it meant to lead. Hours later, as dawn bled across the horizon, Harris sat on the steps outside the barracks, exhaustion pulling at every bone. Sarah joined him quietly, lowering herself beside him. Do you know why I didn't take command tonight? She asked. Harris shook his head. Because it wasn't my fight. It was yours. I could have led them. But if I had, you'd still be the sergeant who shoved an admiral against a wall. Tonight, you became something else. Harris exhaled, the weight of her words sinking deep. And what's that? Sarah's lips curved faintly. A leader worth following. The silence that followed wasn't heavy anymore. It was grounding. But even as Harris allowed himself that moment of pride, he knew Sarah was right. The saboteurs weren't finished. This had only been the beginning. And the next time they struck, the price would be even higher. Still, for the first time, Harris wasn't afraid of the test to come. Because now, he wasn't facing it alone. The morning after the attack, the base looked like a wounded beast. Smoke still curled from the motor pool. Black streaks marked the concrete walls, and medics rushed between makeshift triage stations. Soldiers moved slower than usual. their bodies heavy with fatigue, but there was something different about their faces, something Harris had never seen before. It wasn't just survival. It was belief. They believed in him. For Harris, that realization was heavier than the battle itself. He'd carried fear like a weapon for years, convinced it was the only way to command. But last night, under fire, fear had broken. Trust had replaced it. Sarah Mitchell had known this would happen. He could see it in her eyes as she walked the yard at dawn, speaking quietly to soldiers, stopping to inspect damaged fortifications, never letting fatigue slow her step. She'd orchestrated everything, not the attack itself, but the crucible it created. By noon, the investigation was in full swing. Intelligence officers analyzed shell casings, uniforms, and the strange insignia found on one of the saboteurs' gear. But as reports filtered in, one truth became undeniable. This was no rogue band. This was organized, coordinated, funded, and it wasn't finished. That evening, Harris was summoned to the command post. Sarah was waiting inside, leaning over the operations table, her hand resting on a map of the region. "Sit," she said, without looking up. He obeyed, unease curling in his gut. She finally raised her eyes. "The men who hit you weren't random saboteurs. They belonged to a private military outfit operating under the radar. Mercenaries." Harris frowned. Mercs don't throw themselves against fortified bases without good pay. "Who's behind them?" Sarah hesitated, then turned a file toward him. Inside was a photograph grainy, taken from surveillance footage. A man in civilian clothes, mid-50s, sharp jaw, eyes cold as stone. Harris froze. "I know him," he muttered. "You should," Sarah said. "Colonel Victor Kane, retired, dishonorably discharged 10 years ago." Harris clenched his jaw. Kane had been one of his instructors early in his career. A man infamous for brutality, for pushing soldiers to their breaking points, preaching strength through fear. Harris had respected him once, maybe even admired him. Now he felt only a chill. "What's he doing leading mercs?" Harris asked. "Revenge," Sarah replied flatly. "Against the Navy. Against me." Harris blinked. "Against you?" Sarah folded her arms, her voice steady but edged with something personal. 10 years ago, Kane was my commanding officer. I reported him for misconduct, abuse of power, unlawful operations. It ended his career. He swore he'd ruin mine in return. For years he disappeared. Now it seems he's returned. The weight of her words sank deep. This wasn't just sabotage, it was personal. Kane wanted Sarah humiliated, destroyed. And Harris, by extension, had become part of the battlefield. That night, the alarm blared again. But it wasn't gunfire this time, it was infiltration. Kane's mercenaries had slipped inside under disguise, planting charges in the communications hub. By the time Harris arrived, smoke and sparks filled the control room. Soldiers wrestling masked intruders in brutal hand-to-hand combat. Harris didn't hesitate, he waded into the chaos, disarming one merc with a sharp elbow, slamming another into a console. But even as they gained control, the sound of a helicopter thundering overhead drew every eye upward. On the roof, floodlights illuminated a figure descending by rope. Victor Kane. Harris sprinted to the roof with Sarah at his side. Wind whipped across the platform, the helicopter hovering like a predator, its spotlight fixed on them. Kane stood tall, unmasked, his face carved by years of bitterness. He smirked as his boots hit the concrete. "Well, if it isn't the Admiral and her pet sergeant," he sneered. His voice carried the same venom Harris remembered from training years ago. "I see you've broken him in. Mitchell's lapdog now, eh, Harris?" Harris bristled, but Sarah's steady hand on his arm kept him grounded. Kane's eyes glittered. You think you won last night? That wasn't a battle. That was a message. And here's another. He lifted a small device, a detonator. Your base, your men, your reputation, gone with the press of a button. Soldiers raised rifles, but Kane's helicopter loomed above, its side gunners locked on them. One wrong move, and half the roof would be shredded. Sarah stepped forward, unflinching. This ends tonight, Kane. You're finished. Kane laughed. No, Admiral. You are. Your career, your base, your legacy, they'll all burn. And I'll be the one remembered. He thumbed the trigger. Nothing happened. Kane frowned, pressed again. Still nothing. From behind him, a voice crackled through the helicopter's comms. Device neutralized. Extraction compromised. Sarah's lips curved faintly. Did you really think I wouldn't prepare for you? We intercepted your codes this morning. You're already defeated, Kane. Rage twisted his face. He lunged at Sarah, but Harris was faster. He intercepted, the two men colliding with bone-crunching force. The fight was brutal. Kane was older, but he fought with feral strength, each blow fueled by years of bitterness. Harris matched him, not with anger, but with control. Every strike Kane landed tried to drag him back into old habits, into fear and fury. But Harris remembered Sarah's lessons. Leadership wasn't dominance, it was restraint. Finally, with a sharp twist, Harris disarmed Kane and drove him to the ground, pinning him. Breathless, Kane spat. You're weak, Harris. Mitchell's tamed you. Men don't follow the weak. Harris tightened his grip, meeting Kane's eyes with calm steel. No, they follow the strong, the ones they trust. That's why they'll never follow you. The words silenced Kane more than the chokehold. Sarah stepped forward, signaling the soldiers to take Kane into custody. The helicopter retreated, its pilots abandoning him to his fate. For the first time in years, Victor Kane was truly powerless. Hours later, as Kane sat in restraints awaiting transfer, Harris and Sarah stood at the edge of the roof, watching dawn break again over the battered base. You've changed, Sarah said quietly. Harris exhaled, his chest still heaving from the fight. Maybe I just finally figured out what you've been trying to teach me. She smiled faintly. You figured it out in time. That's what matters. Silence lingered, broken only by the distant sounds of soldiers rebuilding what had been damaged. Harris glanced at her. What happens now? Sarah looked back at him, her eyes reflecting both exhaustion and pride. Now, Sergeant Harris, you lead, because whether you like it or not, they've chosen you. He followed her gaze. Below, soldiers looked up at him with respect, true respect. Not fear, not duty, trust. For the first time in his life, Harris felt not just like a survivor of war, but the kind of leader who could shape its outcome. And though the battles ahead were uncertain, one truth remained unshakable. The sergeant who once shoved an admiral against the wall had become the leader she always believed he could be.